It was the winter of 1944, the war's dying breath, yet Europe was still burning. In a small British field hospital outside Caen, the air reeked of antiseptic and sorrow. Nurses moved like ghosts through the dim corridors, their hands steady, their hearts not. Outside, artillery thundered far away, a dull reminder that the world had not stopped killing. Among the wounded that night was a young German soldier, barely 23. His uniform had been cut away, his chest bandaged, his dog tag removed. The others called him the quiet one. He didn't scream when the morphine ran out. He didn't ask for home. He only stared at the ceiling as if counting sins. The nurse assigned to him, Margaret Ellis, had seen too many men die to be moved by another face. Yet something about him was different. His eyes didn't hold hatred. They held something heavier, a silence that begged to be understood. For days, he said nothing. But then one night, when the rain wouldn't stop tapping against the canvas roof, he spoke. His English was fractured, but his voice carried a strange calm. "I must tell someone. Before I die." Margaret hesitated, unsure whether to listen. She was not a confessor, not a priest, only a nurse patching the broken pieces of a war she didn't start. But what he said next would unravel everything she believed about the enemy, about guilt and about forgiveness. Because buried beneath his confession was not a secret about battles or orders, but about his family, his child, and a truth so human it transcended sides. A German soldier, a British nurse, a moment in the ruins of war where compassion dared to breathe again. Before that night of confession, there were weeks of silence and survival. The year was 1944. Normandy, a land torn between liberation and ruin. The British had set up temporary hospitals near the coast, where wounded soldiers, both friend and foe, arrived in endless waves. The war had grown colder, crueler. Civilians fled shattered villages. Soldiers were brought in with frostbitten limbs and eyes that no longer blinked. Every tent smelled of disinfectant, blood, and despair. Margaret Ellis, the nurse who would soon hold a dying man's truth, had joined the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service in 1940. By now, she had seen Dunkirk, the Blitz, and the invasion of France. She had learned to keep her heart quiet, to treat the uniform, not the man. But even silence has a breaking point. When German soldiers began arriving as prisoners, many nurses struggled to touch them. The war propaganda had done its work. The enemy was faceless, monstrous. Yet Margaret's unit was ordered to treat every wounded man equally. "Pain has no nationality," their captain had said. That's when he arrived, Hans Adler, a corporal from the Wehrmacht, rescued from a ruined farmhouse near Caen. Shrapnel had torn through his side, and infection threatened to finish what the bullet had started. He was unconscious when they carried him in, his face pale, lips cracked, a photograph clenched in his hand. Margaret had noticed the photo first, a woman and a little boy standing in a sunlit garden. Their smiles felt out of place amid the chaos. She slipped it into a drawer beside his bed, not knowing it would soon unlock the story he carried inside. Days passed. Hans drifted between fever and waking. When he opened his eyes, the first thing he asked, in broken English, was whether the photo was safe. Margaret nodded, curious but cautious. He thanked her softly. Then silence returned. Outside, Allied bombers flew overhead. The war machine thundered on. Within the hospital, nurses moved from bed to bed, replacing bandages, whispering prayers. Some British soldiers scowled at the idea of caring for a German. One had muttered, "Why waste morphine on them?" Margaret said nothing, but her hands trembled as she cleaned Hans's wound. There was something fragile about him. Not weakness, but resignation, as if he had already accepted his fate long before the bullet struck. He rarely slept, often staring at the tent's ceiling for hours. Sometimes, when the wind blew hard, he murmured words in German, too soft to translate. Then one morning, while checking his pulse, Margaret noticed his scars. Not from combat, but older, fainter lines around his wrists. Marks of rope, or perhaps shackles. She said nothing, but the question burned inside her. As his health slowly returned, so did his humanity. He thanked her for the water, asked about the weather, even smiled once when she joked about British rain never ending. It was a strange peace, two enemies speaking quietly as the world outside tore itself apart. But in that calm, there was also weight. The photograph, the scars, the silence between his words. One evening Margaret found him awake, holding the photo close to his chest. His eyes were red, his lips trembling. She thought he was in pain. But the pain was not physical. It was something older, buried deep. She wanted to ask, but she didn't. Nurses weren't meant to know stories. They were meant to heal, to move on, to forget faces. Yet, that night, she couldn't sleep. His silence followed her like a shadow. By dawn, she realized she didn't want to see him as the German soldier anymore. She wanted to know who he was before the uniform, before the orders, before the guilt. What she didn't know was that he had been waiting for someone, anyone, who would listen. Because Hans Adler's secret wasn't just about his family. It was about a betrayal, a choice made long before the gunfire, one that would haunt him until his final breath. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It washed the blood from the field outside the hospital and turned the roads to mud. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp bandages and rusted metal trays. Nurses whispered over the groans of men who dreamed of home but woke to pain. Hans Adler lay still among them, his breath shallow, eyes fixed on the ceiling. But something in him was changing. The quiet endurance that once seemed stoic now looked like a burden too heavy to hold. Margaret noticed it first in the way he avoided the photograph. For days it had stayed near his pillow. Now it remained in the drawer, untouched. Each time she reached for it to clean the space, his gaze hardened. Not in anger, but in shame. "Do you have family, Nurse Ellis?" he asked one evening, voice barely more than a whisper. "Yes," she replied after a pause. "A brother. He's in Italy." Hans nodded slowly. "You worry for him?" "Every day." "Then you understand," he said. "When you love someone, you don't always do good things to protect them." She looked at him, unsure what to say. War had taught her that people did cruel things out of fear. But there was a strange honesty in his tone, as if confession was not a choice, but a necessity. Over the next few days, bits of his story began to surface. Born in Hamburg, Hans had studied engineering before being drafted in 1939. His father, a decorated veteran from the Great War, believed service to the Reich was a duty, not a choice. Hans followed the command like millions of others, out of loyalty, not conviction. He spoke of his wife, Clara, and their little boy, Emil, both living under Allied bombardment. "I built bridges," he said, "never fired a gun until France." But then his words faltered. Margaret didn't press him. She had seen what guilt could do to soldiers. It wasn't the wounds that broke them. It was memory. One night, as the wind howled through torn canvas, he called for her. His face was pale, sweat pooling on his forehead. "I remember their faces," he murmured. "Not the enemy, my own men." He told her about a village near Cherbourg. Orders had come to burn it after resistance fighters ambushed their convoy. They said it was necessary to make example. Hans had protested, saying there were children inside. But command didn't listen. He paused, eyes glassy. "I did nothing. That's my sin. I watched." Margaret's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that mercy was rare in war, that survival often meant silence. But she couldn't. The truth was heavier than sympathy. Hans continued, voice trembling. The fire spread fast. Screams, smoke. Then one soldier, Müller. He pulled a woman out of a house. She was holding a child. He was shot for disobedience. Hans looked at her with hollow eyes. "After that, I built the bridge as they ordered." "But every beam I placed—" I heard their voices again. For a long time, Margaret said nothing. The tent was quiet except for the rain tapping on the canvas like distant footsteps. Then she asked, "And your family? What about them?" He looked away. "That is the second sin." A week later, the hospital prepared to relocate as Allied troops advanced. Many prisoners were being moved to camps inland. Margaret's time with Hans was ending, yet his eyes followed her every step, as if the confession wasn't finished. On the last night before the transport, he finally reached for the photo again. His fingers shook as he held it. "You've been kind to me, Nurse Ellis, more than I deserve. But before they take me, you must know the truth." She sat beside him, heart beating hard. What truth? He hesitated, tears welling for the first time. "The woman and child in this picture, they are not waiting for me in Hamburg. They are gone. Not from bombs. From me." Margaret's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Hans closed his eyes. "My wife was Jewish. When new laws came, I hid her papers, told my superiors she was Aryan. For a while, it worked. But one night, they came to inspect our home. My neighbor had spoken. They found her. My son cried. They took both." His voice cracked like dry wood. "I didn't stop them. I stood there in my uniform, afraid to speak. The next day, they sent me to the front. A promotion, they called it. A reward for loyalty." He turned the photograph toward her, and only then did she see the small Star of David carved faintly into the back of the frame. "I built bridges," he whispered. "But I burned the one that mattered." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. There were no sides anymore, no uniforms, no flags, only two souls broken by choices the world forced upon them. Outside, the rain stopped. The night fell silent. Hans looked at her once more, his voice soft, final. "Do you see now, Nurse Ellis? That's the truth I must confess." She didn't answer. The silence between them said everything words couldn't. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Mist clung to the ground like smoke refusing to leave the battlefield. The convoy trucks waited beyond the hospital fence, engines idling, ready to move prisoners inland. The war was still raging, but within the thin walls of that field hospital, something quieter, something more human, was coming to an end. Margaret had barely slept. Hans's words had echoed in her mind all night. "I built bridges, but I burned the one that mattered." She had treated countless men over the years. Soldiers who'd lost limbs, eyes, or hope, but none had made her question the meaning of duty like he did. When she entered the ward, he was already awake. The photograph lay on his chest. His eyes looked distant, like a man half in this world and half in the one he wished to see again. "You should rest," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "I dreamed of the sea. My boy liked the sea." Margaret sat beside him. "Where did they take them?" Hans hesitated. "A camp outside Berlin. I searched after the orders changed, when we heard whispers of what was really happening. But by then it was too late." He swallowed hard. "I don't even know if they were alive when I was sent to France. I kept the photo so I wouldn't forget what mercy looks like." There was a pause. A long one. Then Margaret asked the question that had been gnawing at her since the confession. "Why tell me this? Why now?" He turned his head slowly toward her. "Because I don't want the last thing I remember to be silence. I was silent when they came for my family. Silent when they burned the village. If I die now without speaking, then I have learned nothing." Margaret's throat tightened. "You think speaking can change what happened?" Hans gave a faint, broken laugh. "No, but maybe it can change what you remember." Outside, a nurse shouted names. Prisoners were being loaded onto trucks. Margaret knew they would come for him soon. She reached for the photograph. "May I keep this?" He nodded slowly. "If I don't make it through the camps, burn it, so no one can use their faces for propaganda. They deserve peace, not pity." The sound of boots echoed closer. Two British soldiers stepped into the ward, rifles slung casually. "Transport's ready, ma'am," one said. Margaret rose, her hands trembling. She wanted to say something, anything that would make this moment bearable, but no words came. Instead, she took his pulse one last time, pretending to do her duty while her heart fractured beneath the surface. Hans looked up at her with eyes stripped of uniform and guilt. "Nurse Ellis," he said softly, "if your brother returns from Italy, tell him that not every German believed in what we were told. Some of us just didn't know how to stop the tide." She nodded, unable to speak. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, his face grew pale, his breathing ragged. The movement had reopened his wound. Blood seeped through the fresh bandage. Margaret called for help, but it was too late. The infection, the exhaustion, the weight of memory. It was all too much. Hans Adler, the man who had confessed too late, died before the truck left the yard. For a long time, no one spoke. One of the soldiers covered his face with a sheet. Another made a note in the record. Prisoner expired. Cause, septicemia. Margaret stood there, hands still, eyes fixed on the sheet. The war had taken thousands, but this death felt different. Quieter, crueler. A man who had finally found the courage to speak had run out of time. Later, when the trucks rolled away, she walked back into the ward alone. The photograph lay folded beneath his pillow. She held it, tracing the outline of the smiling child. Then she turned it over. The faint Star of David on the back, catching a beam of light. For the first time since the war began, she cried without restraint. In that tent, among rows of silent beds, Margaret Ellis realized the truth of every war, that it doesn't end when the guns stop, but when someone dares to understand the enemy's pain. She kept the photograph for years, not as a memory of a German soldier, but as a reminder that compassion can exist even in the darkest ruins. And somewhere, beyond the noise of history, the bridge Hans spoke of, between guilt and grace, began to rebuild itself. The war ended the following spring. Europe exhaled a sigh that carried both victory and grief. Streets filled with cheers, but behind every celebration were empty chairs, unopened letters, and faces that would never return. For Margaret Ellis, peace did not feel like relief. It felt like a hollow room where echoes refused to fade. The field hospitals closed one by one, their tents collapsing into the mud like forgotten prayers. Nurses were sent home, soldiers were discharged, and medals were handed out, tokens to decorate trauma. She returned to London that summer. The city was scarred but breathing again. Walls patched, trains running, lights flickering through blackout curtains that no one yet trusted to open. She resumed her work at a civilian hospital, healing wounds that no longer came from bullets, but from hunger, despair, and loss. The photograph stayed in her bedside drawer, untouched but never forgotten. Sometimes, when thunder rolled across the sky, she would take it out and stare at the faces. The woman's gentle smile, the boy's small hand holding his mother's. She had memorized every detail, the faint sunlight behind them, the unspoken peace they carried. Years passed. Margaret never married. She said once to a colleague, "I've already seen what love looks like when it's lost." In 1952, while volunteering at a refugee clinic, she met a woman from Germany who mentioned a name, Adler. The woman had worked with post-war records, trying to trace families displaced by the Holocaust. Margaret hesitated, then asked if the name Hans Adler appeared anywhere. The woman checked a small notebook, then looked up. Yes, he's listed as deceased, but his son, Emil, survived. He was found in a camp, adopted by relatives in Munich. Margaret felt her breath catch. She didn't know whether to cry or smile. That night, she took out the photograph again. The boy's face, Emil, was no longer just a memory frozen in time. He had lived. He had survived what his father could not undo. For the first time in years, she whispered aloud, "Your father loved you." She never contacted him. Some truths, she believed, belonged to silence. But she wrote a letter anyway, one she would never send. Describing the man she had met in that field hospital, the confession, the regret, the bridge he tried to rebuild with his last breath. She sealed the letter with the photograph inside and kept it in a small wooden box labeled "Only," for the day peace truly arrives. When Margaret Ellis died in 1973, her belongings were donated to a museum that preserved wartime letters. The box was opened decades later, and inside, the photograph was found, still uncreased, the faint Star of David still visible on the back. Curators debated whether to display it publicly. In the end, they chose to leave it unnamed, with a simple note beneath. Found in a nurse's collection. Normandy, 1944. The bridge between enemies. No one knew the full story. No one needed to. Because some histories are not written in textbooks or victory parades. They live in quiet moments between a dying soldier and the one who chose to listen. And in that silence, the war finally ended. In the stillness that followed, even the earth seemed to remember, not the battles, not the nations, but the human hearts that tried to forgive.